You're listening to the Shaun of the South podcast, brought to you by Food City, dedicated to providing you, their valued customer, with top quality products at the best value every day. From certified Angus beef to locally grown produce and in-store made baked goods, nobody does food like Food City. Find a store conveniently located near you at foodcity.com. Well, today, if you hear a lot of background noise, that's because somebody is draining my septic tank. Hallelujah. It's a wonderful feeling, a wonderful day to be alive. And I imagine the guys out there draining the septic tank are having a marvelous day, knee deep in whatever is flowing from the septic tank. I wanted to talk to you today about newspapers. I love newspapers. I adore newspapers. There's nothing I miss half so much as beginning my morning with an unfurled newspaper. It's a hard thing. You can't find them much anymore. But newspapers at one time in America used to be everything, and I miss them. I wish we could, our culture revolved around them. Recently, I went looking for a newspaper. We were out. It was a small town somewhere in the southeast, a big shopping complex off the interstate. You know, they had the Best Buys and the Red Lobsters and the Ultas and the Olive Gardens and the Outback Steakhouses and the Targets and all the other franchises that transform American towns into carbon copies of themselves, from oil slick to shining oil slick. And I walked into a gas station to buy coffee and a newspaper, but something was wrong. The kid was playing on his phone. He was like, "Sorry, sir, we don't have no newspapers here." And I said, "Well, do you know where I might find some?" And the kid looked up from his device and he thought about it. And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, "Well, I got some real estate magazines out there." And I looked out the window and I saw this plastic dispensing thing with the cabinet door on it, shaped like a house. And it had real estate magazines written on the front. And I said, "I'm not looking for real estate." And the kid shrugged and he said, "Well, this is a really great place to live." So I drove around and I was thinking, I can find a newspaper at a grocery store. You can always find newspapers at grocery stores. At least that's what I thought. And I know newspapers aren't in vogue anymore, but just one thing in my hand that's made of paper would have been nice. And so I walked into the grocery store and I said, "Excuse me, do you sell newspapers?" And the kid was dressed like a surfer, 32 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and he looked at me with that look. I think you know the look I mean. My grandfather used to say this look is where you can look into someone's eyes and you can see the back of their skull. But for the purposes of this podcast, I will call that look a vacant stare. And the kid said to me, he said, "Bro, we don't sell newspapers." And I said, "Really? You don't think you sell newspapers?" He said, "No." And he itched his hair and he sniffed his fingers. He said, "Well, let me ask a manager." Well, the manager was a young woman. She was very friendly, very organized, and she smiled and she informed me, "We don't sell newspapers, but we have a free magazine rack by the entrance. Now, it's mostly just real estate magazines, but that's what we have." And I said, "But I'm not looking for real estate. I don't want to relocate here." And she said, quote unquote, "Well, there's some very good articles written by realtors." So that day, I went to the bookstore, and it was a tiny store. And I walked in and I was hoping that they might have something. I would read anything at this point. And the cashier was maybe 17 and she shook her head and she said, "I'm sorry, we don't have a newspaper in this town anymore. I think you used to could find newspapers online here, but we don't even have that anymore." I said, "But where do local people get their news?" And she said, "Well, I don't think anyone wants the local news anymore. Nowadays," she said, "everyone just wants to fight about politics online." Well, in light of all that, I'd like to read you something that I wrote about newspapers. I love newspapers. I love the feel of them. I love the culture that we used to have that surrounded news printed on paper. Newspapers have a smell. If you're lucky enough to find a physical newspaper in our digital world, you will notice the smell first. Fresh newsprint paper, soy seal ink, still warm. Oh, it's a unique scent. You see, I grew up throwing newspapers. Not on a bicycle. My mother and I threw newspapers riding in her beat-up Nissan. We threw papers every day of the week. Weekends, holidays, rainy weather, snow, Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve. Our mornings went as such. We woke up at 2:30 a.m. That's right. We arrived at West Marine at 3 o'clock a.m., whereupon a delivery truck would pull up carrying a pallet of Northwest Florida daily news, and this pallet was about the size of an average Hardee's. Then Mama and I would hole up in her car, wrapping newspapers while eating breakfast, usually Pop-Tarts or ham sandwiches. Wrapping was the hardest part. You had to roll each paper into a tight tube, and then you shoved the paper into a tubular plastic sleeve, which was about the same circumference as a number 2 pencil. Once a newspaper was wrapped, you tossed it into the back seat where your kid sister sat. She had pigtails, and she was busily wrapping newspapers of her own. And your hands, when you were done, they looked like a coal miner's. Now, there's not much to listen to on the radio at 3 in the morning, but if you didn't mind AM radio, you could listen to classic reruns of Paul Harvey. Oh, we were big Paul Harvey fans. When we finished, the back seat was so weighted down with newspapers, the rear axle sagged against the pavement, shooting sparks into the night at full speed whenever you hit a bump. My sister rode in back, buried in rolled-up newspapers, and I rode up front, reciting the current list of subscribers to my mother from a giant clipboard. And this is where the real work began. We all had roles in that vehicle. Mama was the pilot, kid sister was munitions, and I was the tail gunner. We'd crank down the window and throw newspapers across Northwest Florida. We delivered several 100 billion papers each morning, sometimes more. We sped through neighborhoods throwing until our arms and shoulders were dislocated. The morning shift cops knew us by name, and they never pulled Mama over for speeding, because she delivered their papers. She took corners on 2 wheels. We called her Mama Earnhardt. Occasionally, we'd park and throw papers on foot. This was a true test of endurance. We'd walk the breezeways of apartment buildings, wearing huge satchels my mother had sewn by hand that carried hundreds of papers, it seemed, tossing armfuls of newsprint. We stocked news vending machines around town. We wore those heavy satchels weighted with papers and dropped them on people's doorsteps. We delivered to hotels, offices, condos, high-rises, you name it. We also received complimentary papers, and we always read them. Oh yes, front to back. After all, this was our product. One Sunday morning, after throwing papers, the sun was rising, and we parked in front of Winn-Dixie, eating donuts and drinking coffee. My sister was reading the funnies, and Mama was reading the want ads. And I read a column written by a humorist. And I remember saying aloud, one day, I want to write for newspapers. Well, I remember that my mother lowered her paper, and her face was tired, the face of a tired young widow. One day, she replied, maybe you will. Maybe you will. Well, yesterday I picked up a copy of a local paper. I saw my name in print, and beneath the byline were 600 average words, poorly written words, actually. But suddenly I could hear Paul Harvey's voice on a scratchy Nissan stereo. And I could taste Pop-Tarts and coffee, and I could smell newsprint. Because as I say, newspapers have a smell. Well, thanks for listening to Sean of the South. I've been your host today, Sean Dietrich, and it has been a true privilege to to find out anything more about what I do, you can visit SeanDietrich.com, or for those who are not particularly good spellers, you can visit SeanOfTheSouth.com, and there you can find out all sorts of information that you didn't know you didn't need to know about me. And while you're there, I hope you take the time to drop me a line. Tell me what's important to you. Tell me what's going on in your life. I'd like to hear it. And in case anyone hadn't told you today already, I love you. Now go say that to somebody else. Have a great day.